Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 4, seminar 4 of What is the Human? This week, we're looking at the unconscious mind, and particularly as it applies in Freud's work. He's the kind of focal theorist for this week. And we are very fortunate to have with us Nicola Redhouse, who is an accomplished Australian writer, written a whole series of different genres, essay and fiction and so on. I won't embarrass her now by parading in front of her and you her numerous accomplishments, but I will at least parade this latest accomplishment in front of all of you, unlike the Harder University of Queensland Press book. A fantastic book and very relevant to the concerns of this week. It weaves in an amazing way personal history with theoretical reflections about the human being, and particularly the relationship of mind and brain. Has been widely praised, and we are very lucky to have her setting aside a bit of time this week for us, and we're really fortunate as a result. And thank you so much, Nicola, for coming along to have a chat with me about this stuff.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
So look, the first thing I wanted to ask you was, and it's a bit of a soundbitey question but let's start simple. What do you think is the essence of Freud's work? What do you think is distinctive or something that we can take away from it that's important?
I think it's probably his very specific conceptualization of the unconscious mind. So a lot of people before him had come up with theories about there being a part of the mind that we aren't conscious of. But Freud's conceptualization was of it as something that compels us to sort of repeat behaviors that we can't necessarily make sense of, or that sometimes even bring us pain or no gain. So I think it's really helped us to move forward in understanding sort of why we might find ourselves in mental pain that we can't seem to overcome, that we can't understand. Yeah.
Okay, so let me just flesh it out. So there's two things there. One was that, okay, so it seems fairly obvious in some ways that there's parts of our mind that are not conscious, at least not immediately. So if I were to say to you, all right, think of your best friend when you were 10, suddenly you could bring that to mind. You weren't conscious of it before, you are conscious of it now. But that's not really in essence what Freud's talking about, is he? You were saying there that this idea of a repetition of things that are not helpful, that we are compelled to kind of act out. It's a slightly scary idea of the mind, that we do things that are not good for us, or that we act out repeatedly based on a certain unconscious pattern.
I mean, that. So what I've done in my book was to ask, because that's quite a that's quite a massive thing to say about the human mind. And one of the the criticism that Freud's come up against, one of the many, is that how can we sort of proceed with treating people's mental health based on that kind of idea if we don't have proof of it? Do we have proof of it? And I mean, it's almost impossible to prove that kind of unconscious mind. So that's one of the things that I was asking in my book and interested in is, do we have proof of this idea, and can we look at it scientifically? So I'm more interested now in what we do know about that, sort of from a neuroscience point of view. I think I can't even remember now what your question was. I think you asked.
No, you answered it perfectly, even whether you don't remember it. I mean, so I'll push a bit further along a similar line. So, what do you think that his concept of what do you think his idea of the human is, or how are we forced in relation to his work to rethink the human? Because I mean, his work is hugely influential at a cultural level.
Yeah.
Well, how do you think he forces us to rethink what a human is?
So I think that Freud's work really kind of galvanizes the significance of the human being's subjective experience of self, and the place of language and memory in that kind of experience, as being central to what it is to be human. So the human mind, in his kind of concept of it, is this really specifically dynamic entity where you've got memory and language and symbol and all those things kind of working in a dynamic way to drive our behavior, even our, most basic behaviors like our bodily needs like hunger or thirst. So, the difference, I guess, the way that I don't know if it reconceives, but the way that it conceives of human as different to animal is that in his conceptualization, animals don't have that that dynamism of language and memory that plays into their sense of self, and also that missing gap of knowledge in their unconscious, which drives their behavior.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Very interesting. Now, I just want to, we did not script this, but you have in fact connected with something we have just talked about, right? Like this, I didn't plan this connection necessarily, but last week in the unit, we were looking at human language and symbolization, the idea that the human is the language creature or the creature engaged in symbolic representation. Now, that's interesting that this appears also in Freud's work. And so I guess, and sometimes psychoanalysis is referred to as the talking therapy, right? As opposed to the therapy that has sticking things into your head or something like this. So,
yeah.
so language ends up being quite important to Freud's
so
therapy.
I mean, I think essential to psychoanalytic work, even in the way that it's moved now, which is quite for some practitioners far from what Freud had sort of envisaged. It relies on being able to symbolize, and so that's kind of essential. I mean, Freud actually, he loved dogs, and he had I think his dogs with him in his consulting room, but I don't think that he ever allowed one to undergo psychoanalysis. So I'm not really sure what.
I didn't know about that. Right.
Yeah.
So he was a dog fan.
Yeah, he had. I can't remember what they were now, but they were. When I think of them, I see sort of a Pomeranian type, but I don't know. I can't remember what they were.
With a lot of hair, regardless.
A lot of hair, yeah. Fur.
Well, I guess the thing is, and in everything you've said, like it's very interesting, but I suppose in the popular mind, the Freud that we deal with is one that hasn't been mentioned yet, and that's the Freud obsessed with sex. It's all about sex. It all comes down to the libido and what do you think of that idea? Both the cliche about him, that's what it's reducible to, and also whether, is it all reducible to sex? Is that a mischaracterization of Freud? And if it's not, is it a good picture of human beings?
Well, I think there's two things to keep in mind. The one is that in the climate that he was working in the era that he was working in, and he was interested in this idea of repression and what our mind holds back from knowing, sex and anything to do with sex was incredibly taboo in ways that it isn't now, or is less so now. So that would be the first thing that would be being repressed. So that's where the interest lay. But more significantly, I think, is to understand about his work is the fact that he actually saw mental life as being very much tied to the body. So the mind as being embodied. So in this way, it was tied to biology. And people don't really think of Freud as kind of a biologist, but he was actually working, within a Darwinian kind of framework. So biological forces were incredibly important to what he was thinking about in terms of the mind and the brain. And what he saw, what he conceived about the mind was just as much under the sway of ideas of natural selection as any other sort of biological feature. And so that's one of the reasons that sexuality takes such, an important place in his concept of the mind. But I think the other thing that's important to keep in mind is that his idea of sexuality or what was sexual is broader than what we tend to think of reflexively as sexual. So it's anything kind of generative or life-giving. So appetite, eating, pleasure, anything in that realm.
That's really interesting. Okay, so it's moving in two directions. One is it's a broader conception of sex, and another, well, there's three things. The second is this emphasis on sex ties to a Darwinian idea, which you get in notions of both natural selection and I suppose later sexual selection in Darwin's work. And the third you're saying about that if you're dealing with repression, then you're dealing in the kind of late 19th century, sex is one of the things that's become taboo. And if you believe Foucault's work now, it's the one thing we can't stop talking about. So maybe it's going to factor less in contemporary forms of repression. Well, one of the you know, and I won't detain you forever, but there's just a couple of things that's still here that I want to run by you. One of the, I guess, another cliche, and one of the criticisms that you get in Adolf Grunbaum's work, you get it in, who else? Frederick Crews. It's interesting, right? Because he's a literary theorist. But anyway, you get often this critique of Freud that comes forward. It's like, oh, look, this isn't scientific anymore. This isn't, you know, we've got brain scans and we've got test tubes, we've got people in white coats. Freud's not scientific. And I guess one of the things that's very interesting about your book, and maybe it's a pattern more generally, this weaving of the personal and the impersonal and the scientific and the non-scientific mind and brain, all this. So in your book, you really do, this is one of the issues you do pursue, is the scientific status of psychoanalysis and Freud's work. What have you come up with in relation to that? What's your answer to those criticisms?
In some sense, I've got some clarity. But what I've come to realize is that the kind of schism between the idea that we should ever approach the treatment of the mind scientifically, and or that we should approach it sort of in a relational kind of way that can't be measured as easily, you know, that remains. So I discovered this field of researchers who call themselves the neuropsychoanalysts. And essentially it's people who have an interest in neuroscience and psychoanalysis, bringing their work together under the kind of, the idea, which is entirely reasonable and true, that there is only one mind. There's not a mind for the sciences and a mind for psychoanalysis. So how can they sort of share their knowledge? And but even there's a huge opposition to that group from psychoanalysts who say, you know, science can never be brought into it, and it's to biologize the mind is destroying the very nature of what we do in our work, which can't be reduced to biology. But I think the thing about like coming back to Freud and this question of science is that he has been surpassed by scientific findings, and he knew himself that he was foiled by scientific limitations even when he was working. So I think it was around the time that he wrote his paper on aphasia, which is a language disorder, because he was a neurologist, working as a neurologist himself, and he realized that he didn't have the tools at his disposal to sort of examine the mind scientifically in the way that he would want to at that point. And it was at that point that he said, right, okay, mental states are, as I talked about right at the beginning, they're dynamically dispersed in the brain. In other words, they're a function of what happens between things. They're a function of what happens between the bit of our brain that makes language and the bit of our brain that holds memory. They're not sort of, we can't pin them down to, this is the snorkel pop where we feel anger. This is the, you know, snorkel pop. Wow, I really know my brain science. And yeah, so what he said was, okay, I'm going to move into clinical work where I'm going to look at individual subjective experience. And in that way, I'm going to try and build a model of the mind based on these individual subjective experiences. And of course, that's, you know, immediately going to be criticized by scientists who are working in the realm of, you know, statistical data and that kind of thing. But what the neuropsychoanalysts are saying is that we are really compelled now to take Freud's work further, because we have all these technologies at our disposal. We have all these methodological advances in neuroscience. We have, one of the key things they're interested in is we have all these developments in affective neuroscience, which is in this mapping of the neural mechanisms of the brain. So the mechanisms that that neuroscientists are now saying is where affect or emotion lie. And we also have a whole lot more that we know about animal behavior in the realm of attachment and separation. Wow. And those areas are the areas where we can bring like quite rigorous scientific method into the study of mind, with Freud's theories as a really good starting point. And why Freud's theories? Well, the neuropsychoanalysts say start with Freud, because Freud, by his conceptualization of the unconscious, gives us the most complete account of the mind, in encompassing both what we know we feel and what we don't know that we feel. So that's kind of where it's at scientifically. But there's this really great quote. One of the people who are opposed to the neuropsychoanalysts have talked about how you can talk about the chemicals that are used in the paint that's used to paint. I can't remember what painting they refer to specifically, but whatever, let's say it was the Mona Lisa. You can talk about the chemicals in that paint, but it's not going to get you any closer to understanding what it is that the Mona Lisa is about or how it moves us. So yeah, that's where
this is, I guess this brings up much bigger questions in philosophy, we would say epistemology, about, you know, the relation of science to knowledge is and quantification to knowledge. Is reason bigger than science? Science is just one part of what we think of as reason or rationality, and there are other bits. Or is the model of reason scientific and quantitative, and everything else needs to? And I mean, and a number of examples, right? You could do a wave diagram of a symphony, but of course, it's going to be accurate. It don't give you any sense of what the meaning of that symphony is, reducible to those wave diagrams.
Yeah, and it's tricky because, you know, a lot of people have said to me, well, what does it matter? Like, why do we need science? But there are, you know, ethical reasons, I guess, and there's also kind of practical reasons, like the way that research is funded and the way that we Medicare covers what we can access. So it's really a tricky area.
It is, and this is where often the science itself in these debates become intensely political and professional issues. So in the same way that often the battle between science and religion, supposedly in the 19th century, was a battle between professional organizations and accreditation. Now, if you look at psychology and the credentialing of psychologists, there is, you know, quite a strict process and a strict set of protocols and conceptions of what psychological knowledge is in action that is quite, it seems to me at least, to be quite narrow.
Yeah, and I mean, at the moment, what's interesting is that there is good data to show that psychodynamic therapy, and what I mean by that is a therapy that uses like a Freudian concept of an unconscious mind. There's good data to show that psychodynamic therapy is as effective, if not more effective, than cognitive behavioral therapy. That's you can look up the work of Jonathan Shedler. He's got a lot written on that, but no one knows specifically why. That's where the question remains. And some of the really interesting work that I've been following is this work that's been looking at the idea that the why is to do with the therapeutic relationship, that it's actually to do with the quality of attachment between the patient and the therapist, and the way that allows the patient to rebuild some parts of themselves that they weren't able to as children. But yeah, so the question still remains, how? Why?
I mean, this is a question, right? Like we didn't need to know how aspirin worked in order to use it as a medicine. I mean, we've been using it for well over 100 years before, when was it, 1986? Basically, the Nobel Prize in Medicine was given for work that ended up teaching us how aspirin worked. We knew it worked, right? And then the question is, well, is being able to specify causal mechanisms essential? I mean, evidence-based medicine seems at least in part to be based on agnosticism with respect to causation, right? We don't know how it works. I mean, it is satisfying though, isn't it? Like, it is more satisfying to know if we think we know how something.
Well, yeah, and I mean, the interesting thing is we actually don't know either how antidepressants work.
No.
We know that that they possibly have something to do with serotonin, but we don't know. There's no evidence to show that people who suffer from depression have a deficit of serotonin. But the point is that, I guess, the difference ethically, or maybe in sort of terms of considerations of treatment, when it comes to psychodynamic therapy or longer term therapies, because any kind of psychodynamic therapy involving the unconscious mind is going to take a while, because it's to do with talking and language and decoding symbols and a deeply felt relationship that you build over time. You know, that's going to be a big investment, time-wise, financially, and a big risk to take if there is no efficacy to be had at the other end, which is why it's a bit different to asprin.
Like 6 sessions and you're on your way. Yeah. So interesting. Thank you so much for joining us. So I'll leave you there. Of course, it probably should go without saying that we could continue this discussion for, I don't know, between a year and 50. But I'll leave it there and allow you to get on with your day, and hopefully we'll see you in class. But it's been such a pleasure to talk to you, and thank you again for putting aside this time.
It's my absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me.